Hello. All right, I see that the sound system works very well. Thank you very much for being here today. My name is Carlos Ortega. I'm the curator at Rancho Los Cerritos. And welcome to the last session of our Roots in California Concepts of Home speaker series. This speaker series is sponsored by California Humanities, and it aims to provide further contexts for the stories featured in our current exhibition that is on display at the Visitor Center. I would like to acknowledge that we are in Gabrielino-Tongva's homeland and that they are the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. I also would like to acknowledge all the volunteers and staff that has helped put this together. Bridger up there, Laura, Mallory, Alfred, and many more. So the title of this panel discussion is Stewards of the Land. It promised to be a very exciting conversation about how the concept of home is perceived and has changed by the many different people who have walked on this site. And today we have AAA panelists that I'm extremely excited to present you. So, first of all, our first panelist tonight is Alison Bruesehoff. She's the executive director of Rancho Los Cerritos historic site. She has 2 decades of museum experience, and her leadership and expertise have been invaluable in ushering in a new era for this historic site. She's been developing a new strategic master plan and welcoming diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility as key elements for the advancement of the institution. Alison holds a Master of Arts in Museum Studies from George Washington University and an MBA with an emphasis in organizational leadership from Woodbury University in Southern California. Thank you, Alison, for being here today. Joining us as well is Gabrielino-Tongva elder Edgar Perez. As a citizen of the Gabrielino-Tongva Nation of the Greater Los Angeles Basin, Edgar has been a tireless advocate for the preservation of the Tongva cultural heritage. His work as a cultural resource monitor and guest speaker has been invaluable in promoting understanding and appreciation of the Gabrielino-Tongva Nation, and we are honored to have him here with us tonight. Our next panelist is Professor Patricia Cleary. She is professor of history at Cal State Long Beach. She has taught senior seminar courses for history majors at Rancho Los Cerritos, including one in which students did research relevant topics to the exhibition we are discussing today. Professor Cleary is the author of multiple books on the history of women and commerce in the Midwestern and East Coast region in the 1700s and 1800s. In her forthcoming book, Mount City, The Place of Indigenous Histories in San Luis, she promises to shed light on the erasure of Native people's histories in that area. We are eager to hear her insights on today's topics as well. Thanks for being here. And I would like to welcome Gloria Sanchez. Gloria is a Chicana Filipino-American interdisciplinary artist, arts facilitator, activist, and emerging curator, and her work is a testament to the power of memory and culture and identity. Her works of art have been featured in some of the most prestigious galleries and institutions across Los Angeles, including Boca Geffen Plaza, the Museum of Latin American Art, among many others. Gloria at Rancho Los Cerritos, she worked with the community to build a living room installation at our current exhibition in the Visitor Center. And please help me welcome them all. And last but but not least, we're counting with moderator Andrea Guerrero. She's a writer, an educator with a passion for contemporary history, art, and BIPOC artist. Her MA thesis, which explores the relevance of Latin American conceptualism to contemporary Latin American and Latinx women artists, is a must read for anyone interested in the intersection of arts and politics. Currently teaching at California State University, Long Beach, Andrea is a vital voice in the art and history world. Andrea is a humanities consultant that we partner with to develop our current exhibition that you can still see at the Visitor Center until June. And we're thrilled to have her moderating the panel this evening, so thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Carlos. Sorry about that. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Everyone, thank you so much for coming and joining us in this discussion. I know the weather has been a little difficult for us these past couple of days, so I really appreciate you all coming out today and being part of this conversation. So first, I would like to ask our panelists. The exhibition that is currently up at Rancho Los Cerritos here explores the concept of home as it relates to the workers who lived on this site in the early 19th century. The early 20th century. And in doing that, we had a lot of conversations about, well, what happens to your concept of home when certain things are introduced to your environment that kind of shift that. And for this particular conversation, we'll be talking about the effects of colonization and settlers who came to California and how that impacted the concept of home for many people who are already living here or who were brought here to work the land and not necessarily benefit from all of that development. So I would like to extend that question to our panelists, and we can begin with Edgar. Just kind of telling us a little bit of your personal concept of home. What does that mean to you? What ideas or feelings does that concept evoke?
Well, Andrea, a very good topic. I'm glad you introduced that. About 2 years ago, I started a project on the genealogy of my family, my mother and my father's side. And my reason for starting it is because my ancestors are the foundation for me. Anyway, they're the ones who are links to the past and to the present, as far as our tribe is concerned. Those links bring expectations, they bring gifts, and they bring promises of what lies ahead for us. What I expected at first was just names and a bunch of dates. I had no idea that it would go beyond that. And I'm still working on that particular project. I have not done yet. I've got some more research to do. I've got some more documentation to cooperate from historical accounts and from church records, so that I can pass that on to my family for the next link, my grandchildren. On my mother's side, she has ancestors who are Spanish and who are Mexican. Those people are the ones who guided the settlers who came from Sonora to California, to Alta California. Very well-known, prominent names. I knew it when I was in high school. I knew the names, but I had no idea the importance of what they contributed. On my father's side, they are the rancheros, they're the Native American, they're the Tongva on the father's side. And so in considering home, Andrea, it really started to come into focus in terms of what home is, the concept of home is developing. And so the latest information that I had on that is that this rancho is home to me. This rancho was started by the Nieto family and the Perez family and eventually the Cota family. The woman who's pictured here in one of these buildings, Rafaela Cota, is related to that Cota that I referred to earlier, the Cotas who came as soldiers, as escorts, missionaries, and to colonists who came here. So, in terms of home, the concept of home, I consider those people on my mother's side who were who brought settlers here and who established this country, this part of California. And so, home to me are the missions, specifically San Diego, San Luis Rey, San Gabriel Mission, and San Fernando, because those are where most of my ancestors are buried, and the majority of them are Mission San Gabriel, where I live today. And so that is, home to me is the missions of California, Southern California, and the Tongva people.
Thank you, Edgar. I would like to ask Gloria now if she can kind of give us a little bit of information about her conflict with home as well.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for having me on the panel. For me, home can connect to your blood relatives, but also your chosen family, whether it be like friends who become family, those people who you feel safe around, those people who you share a reciprocal relationship with, giving before you receive and back and forth. For me, home is also my ceremony fam, so the women that I participate in different ceremonies with and hold space together. Home is somewhere where you can become a better person, where you can grow amongst others. Home is also where my ancestors are from, like Edgar said. My ancestors come from Chihuahua, northern Mexico, and the Philippines. So, though I've never been to those places, I feel a connection to those places as home because that's where my people come from.
Thank you. Pat, can you give us your concept of home?
Sure, and thank you, Andrea, for inviting me to participate. So, as a historian, I first have to think about any term historically, and so I had to look up in the Oxford English Dictionary the chronicle origin of the word home that we have in English, which is ham, H-A-M, which comes from Old English. And the meaning of ham is a dwelling place, a fixed abode or residence, or a village. And you can still hear that village orientation in the English word hamlet, referring to a very tiny village that we don't think of much other than the Shakespeare play, right? That's the hamlet we think of. But what struck me about that definition is the emphasis on permanence of a fixed place of dwelling and a physical space of a home. And when I started to think about it more personally, I was thinking about how definitions of home are connected to identity and to experiences. The sounds and the sights and the smells of home are very powerful and very evocative. And it's clear that home has a very profound shaping role in a person's identity and sense of self. And I was born and raised in St. Louis. Anybody else? One person, my brother. And there's a St. Louis, and I want to just talk about for just a moment T.S. Eliot, a famous poet, a Nobel laureate poet, who, if people refer to him today or are aware of him, it's probably because of a collection of poems published in 1939, Old Possum's Book of Cats, which Andrew Lloyd Webber adapted into the fourth longest running musical on Broadway, Cats. But Eliot grew up in St. Louis, moved to England at the age of 25, but always felt profoundly shaped by having grown up alongside the Mississippi River. And he wrote a letter in which he said, "It is self-evident that St. Louis affected me more deeply than any other environment has ever done. I feel that there is something in having passed one's childhood beside the big river, the Mississippi, which is incommunicable to those people who have not. Something that he can't even express, a poet. It's incommunicable, that sense of self and place is intertwined." He said, "I consider myself fortunate to have been born there rather than in Boston or New York or London. So home is a sense of belonging, a place and a feeling that are tied together and shape who we are, a sense of being part of a place or a group." And just one last quote to Eliot before I hand it back. And this is from the Four Quartets. And it's the idea about how we need to think about a place deeply, to study it, to understand it. He wrote, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time."
Thank you, Pat. Alison, could you give us a little bit of an idea of your concept of home, your personal concept?
My personal concept of home. My personal concept of home somewhat goes into my professional concept of home, and it's the shared history with multiple perspectives. As I have a sister and a brother, and we have the exact same parents. You wouldn't know it by knowing any of us. And when we talk about home, as we can talk about a single situation, we have three very different perspectives on this. And to me, as Carlos was doing this exhibit, was home necessarily isn't a place for me. It's the history, it's the memories that we share and we shift. And as I do more genealogy research on my mother's side, there's a long history all the way back to the Dares and what does that mean, and professional history or personal. But to me, it's about the people, and it's about everyone's perspectives and how the same story has multiple angles to it. So to me, that's home.
Thank you. I think one of the things that, it's interesting that you kind of ended it there in terms of thinking about home as an abstract concept rather than a location. But I do want to kind of ask, because a lot of you brought it up, particularly Gloria and Edgar, in terms of how does land and location really factor into those concepts of home, particularly being people in this part of the state who have such deep connections to the developing Mexican-American identity, right? Who those people are, and even why that identity was kind of introduced and forced upon them. For you guys, what is your consideration? How does land factor into that concept of home? Does it factor into that concept? And it kind of sounded like it did, so I'd like for both of you to kind of elaborate on it. We can begin with Gloria.
Okay. Yeah, I think, like I said before, having a connection to your motherlands is very important for those of us that have the privilege to have that. And also, in terms of like having a safe space to live and consider home. For me, I was born and raised in the Harbor area, and the cities there, Wilmington and Carson, are surrounded by refineries in the port and pollution. And I feel like that's kind of, that's not safe, it's not healthy for a lot of us to live there. And that kind of makes me think about privilege and like who has access to like safety and like a space that allows you to live out a healthy, long life.
Well, it's interesting to kind of think about those ideas, right, of who has access to the land. And I think sometimes when people think of home, they think of having this freedom of kind of going to wherever they can and establishing a home there. But historically speaking, for a lot of people in Southern California, they haven't had that opportunity, that freedom to really kind of go wherever they want to and establish a sense of home. And rather, some people sometimes are being pushed to certain areas, like you're talking about that part of the South Bay that's, riddled with pollution, that we've all seen the refineries, and people have had to live there and grow up there. And it's not all kinds of people who are forced to live there and grow up there. So I think that's something that is really important to consider when we're thinking about these concepts of home, and how some people have had to develop those concepts on land that they probably don't necessarily feel safe or comfortable in, but have had to do so anyway. But then also maintaining that relation to the land, that even though those areas might not be the places, the most safest place to grow up in, there's still a connection, right? A really deep-rooted connection to that land. And I think, Edgar, you were kind of speaking to that a little bit about how you can think about your ancestors being part of these mission systems, these ranchos, and how by thinking of that, you can consider these sites like this like your home. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. The Tongva Gabrielino had no concept of land ownership. They shared resources. They shared kinships, and they also were close to not only plants, but also very close to animals, rocks, hills, trees. They were all important. So land had a larger concept than just having a certain parcel with your name on it and a fence around it. And so when the missionaries arrived here, this land was under the King of Spain. Spain owned the land. The missionaries felt that although they were following policy, they understood that land belonged to the native people. It was their possession. It was not a part of Spain's policy, which of course we now know it was. When the Mexican Republic came here, they changed the concept of land. They started selling land and developing ownership. That concept of ownership from the Mexican Republic, when the American invasion came, they continued that concept of land ownership and started asking, well, Rancho Los Cerritos, well, can you prove that that's your land? Bring the documents to you. Where are your documents that you own this land? And of course, the Indios who had worked here in Los Cerritos, for example, who had no concept of, what are you talking about? Do the Templars own the land? Does Spain own the land? Do the Padres own the land? And so there was quite a bit of confusion there, and in terms of that concept of land. And which brings our tribe to today about the concept of land. We don't have land. We don't have a reservation. In 1852, they sent commissioners to establish treaties, and for the Gabrielino-Tongva, they just skipped over us because we weren't making enough. We weren't creating problems. We weren't stealing cattle and horses. We weren't killing settlers. That was the problem. And so those tribes who were creating problems are the ones who got reservations. And so my concept, or our concept of land, is that we're struggling now. We have been in the process of petitioning the federal government to recognize those agents who came here to establish our treaties, to make treaties with us. So we're still fighting that, even though our ancestors and my grandparents and my great-grandparents who started this petition, we're still fighting for them. And I'm hoping that in my lifetime I can see that we do have some land that is given to us out of the trees that we're supposed to be doing that.
Thank you, Edgar. And to that point, I think it's important to also recognize that the concept of home then starts being a little bit warped by legitimate documents, right? If you don't have a deed to a house, if you don't have any kind of concrete proof that you own a piece of land, it becomes harder for people to claim that ownership. And like Edgar said, these types of documents also create a language barrier for people who probably don't speak English, who have never spoken English, and who certainly couldn't understand very detailed language about laws that never existed here. So I want to ask Pat if you can kind of give us a little bit of information on how these histories are legitimized. Like, what is the process of sort of establishing ownership in certain places, and especially in the United States, like what is the process when settlers come in and start to claim ownership through legal ways that possibly didn't exist before?
Sure, thank you. And Edgar touched on a number of the issues. And again, as a historian, I have to go back before the US, since it was a US early history question, but we really have to go back to Europe and anything post-1492 when Spain and Columbus were at the forefront of territorial expansion and aggression into this hemisphere. And Spain and England and other European powers were engaged in a global competition for military and commercial domination. And as a result of that, Spain and England were trying to establish empires. And those empires were dependent on exploiting resources, both of land and of people. And the states, the successor states to Spain and England, or Mexico and the United States, both of them were what we would call settler colonialist states, in which the policies of the central government, as well as the practices of individual citizens, were targeting native peoples and the appropriation of their lands. And that process happened over and over and over again. Spain established a foothold in California in the late 1760s with the founding of the mission system. Mexico, when it took over in 1821, continued the process of giving large land grants to favored individuals, members of the elite, and lots, hundreds of thousands of acres, millions of acres, was transferred into private landholders' hands. In 1846, when the Mexican-American War started, 800 private landowners owned, technically, most of California. And they did so in part because of what happened after the secularization of the missions in California in 1833. much of the land that is today California was held by missions. As Edgar said, it was native people's lands. And what the Mexican government said would happen after it secularized the mission was that half of that land would be put in the title, put in the names of converted indigenous people, right? People who had already converted to Christianity. But the amount of corruption and the land hunger on the part of powerful Mexican citizens at that point translated into almost all of that land, pretty much all of it, I believe, ending up in the hands of a small number of private landholders. And some of those descendants of Manuel Nieto, whom Edgar mentioned, they sold a chunk of that land, their descendants, to John Temple, who bought the property that is today, the title for the property that is today Rancho Los Cerritos, in I think 1843. And what happened to the native peoples who were living in the area, the Tongva and others, is that they were turned to basically forced labor, tantamount to slavery, really exploited laborers throughout California, so that this adobe was built by indigenous laborers in 1844. And so there's this process through which the labor and the land of native peoples is used by the settler colonists, whether they are Mexican or American. And as Edgar pointed out, that process continued after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 transferred California and most of the southwest of the United States into the hands of the US government. And typically, just one final thing, native peoples were not seen as having justified title to the land, not because of the shared concept of property ownership or communal use that Edgar refers to, but because Europeans and European Americans and European Mexicans characterized them as not using the land in the way that what they called civilized. And they used their misrepresentation, in effect, of indigenous land use patterns to justify land appropriation.
Yes, and I think it's also important to remember that during this process, a lot of people who are coming to California, creating homes here, right, their concept of home is developing. They're starting to gather a sense of belonging here. And at the same time, there's native people here whose concept of home is completely changed. It's, they no longer feel like they can have that concept, that this is no longer their home. And so it's interesting to see, right, how those two concepts are happening at the same time, how someone's concept can be become this beautiful vision of a ranch or an adobe home out here with all this available land, and how at the same time another person's concept of home, the way that they interact with the land, the language that they speak, the family that they have, all of that is starting to kind of fracture and break. And so they're having to negotiate all those things and really kind of consider what home means. And so in that process, I think certain things are gained for some and things are lost for others. And I want to ask Gloria and Edgar about what are these things that get lost and what are the things that get gained?
Yeah, first of all, loss of access to your homelands, to, Native people's relationship that is intrinsically tied to the land and to the plants and animal relatives there. There's a loss of identity within that, a loss of being able to practice your language or culture, and also in the midst of hiding your culture or hiding your identity because you're afraid of being murdered. I've heard that there was like a law that criminalized people for being Native American, for being with that identity. So a lot of people hid under the identity of Spaniard or Mexican. So So that, to me, that's, that's another form of hegemony, besides literal physical massacre. First, it's like the cutting ties with the land, forcing people to sever that relationship. And I think also touching upon what Pat said, that people were enslaved, and there's a lot of criminalization and people being fined because they're homeless, and a lot of Native people have that happen to them where they're in this loop of not being able to pay fines and being put into servitude, aka slavery. So that's another detrimental, traumatic thing that happened to people.
Yeah, the loss of autonomy and the power to really kind of decide for yourself how your future is going to develop and how your relation to your home is going to change, right? Because especially considering people who maybe lived here for their entire lives, who are then turned into or forced into the subjectivity of being a slave, right? Of being slave now to the land and no longer being in connection with the land the way that they used to be. Edgar, what are your thoughts about what is gained and what is lost during these processes?
So a lot was lost out. Language, religion, Native American language, dialects, Native American, Gabrielino-Tongva religion, starting with the missionaries. What was gained was Spanish language. What was gained was Catholicism. What was lost was land, territory. The agents who came here to establish treaties did very well in negotiating, even though they didn't speak Spanish, didn't know anything about customs or traditions, but they did a damn good job of negotiating with tribes and trying to get those treaties ratified by the United States Senate. With the Tongva Gabrielino, there was a treaty that included us. I'm still trying to find signatures. I've been told by historians that somewhere in those treaties that were negotiated, we have a signature. I haven't found one yet that says Gabrielino, because that's what our name was. There was no such thing as Tongva in 1852. When the treaty that was referred to us was submitted to California, the California legislature, they knocked it down and said, no, that's too much land to give them. Why don't we give them a piece over here, but not what they want? But it never happened. All the treaties in California were sent to the United States Senate. The United States Senate rejected all of them. And they were like, by the president's executive order, to be placed in not for public information for about 100 years. And so that's what was lost. What was gained, though, is that now with new laws under the American system, we have tribes that are very wealthy. They have casinos. They have autonomy. They have health services. They have homes for their citizens. That's what was gained. But I think identity was also lost in terms of the Native American appearance. What do we look like? we lost a lot of that in the process from Spain, Mexico, and the United States in terms of intermarriage with all of those cultures. I was doing a presentation in a 4th grade class one time, and after the presentation, a young girl, 4th grader, she came up to me and she says, "Mr. Perez, you don't look like an Indian." And I said, "Well, about 300 years ago, we looked different. I mean, we didn't speak English, we didn't speak Spanish, and we dressed differently. And then we married, other people, and so it's changed." And she just looked at me and said, "Are you really 300 years old?"
Thank you, Edgar. And I think something also that we tend to forget when we have these conversations is that a lot of the, the material aspect of what is lost is pretty apparent, right? I can't imagine people really arguing that Native or Indigenous people didn't lose much in this historical process. But I think what sometimes gets overlooked is the discursive or ideological things that get lost. For example, the concepts of home that existed here 300 years ago, these concepts that we no longer have access to because those theoretical frameworks were not recorded, and if they were recorded, then they were probably destroyed. Or they were, people who remembered those things have been beaten out of them, quite literally, in missions and schools. To have people's ideological, theoretical frameworks be, violently removed from them. That is also something that gets lost. And I think, and there's a interest, it seems now, which is very exciting for all of us, that there's an interest in kind of going back to those things, right? Doing these sort of what I would refer to as like theoretical excavations, like how can we find that information, what those concepts were for people back then, and how can people today, right, people like Edgar or myself or Gloria, how can we connect to those things that were there for our ancestors but are no longer very much accessible to us. And I think like Edgar was saying, one thing that we can kind of count on is the power of these institutions that are willing to help. So I would like to ask Alison about your, how you see institutions, kind of historical or academic institutions, helping us bridge those gaps and kind of recuperating the things that were lost.
Excellent question. So my research has always been in the history of museums. I went to a museum studies program, almost 25 years ago. And the field of museum studies has changed substantially. If you look at the history of museums, they were personal collections that people just took things, made their own collections, and that's, in essence, very harshly, the beginning of museums. And museums for a long time thought they were accessible because they let people through the doors to see the things that they had taken. They thought they were inclusive because they did basic timelines of history within museums. They had diverse collections because they collected all these items so that they were diverse. They were never equitable. And the biggest lesson, I think, for museums is as museums and historical sites need to be relevant and resourceful and resilient and be something to the communities they serve. They switched the term, they now made it DEIA, and it has a very different tone of voice to it. It's about working with diverse communities, not telling them their history, but working with them to learn their histories. It is about being equitable. It's about meeting people's needs and what they need from museums and historical sites. It's about being inclusive and asking people to share their stories that you can include. It's also not being so completely artifact-based. Is museums for a long time, you only talked about the artifact. That was it, what it looked like, what it meant, what it did, but no one ever talked about what it meant to other people and how they use these artifacts and what they could mean to other people. So it's about asking the questions of the communities you serve and that you say you represent. What are your stories? How can this site better represent the history of what a museum's supposed to do? It's about being inclusive, it's about being accessible. So for this site, I'm happy to say we have taken on the concepts of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility and really made it the forefront of the work that we're doing now. To ask people, tell us your stories, tell us how you related to this site. What was your history? You don't look 300 years old, but what was the history 300 years ago? And how can we be sharing that? How can we be better representative of the communities that we serve? And that has been a huge shift in thinking for museums and historical sites, probably within only, honestly, the past 10 to 15 years of how museums really look at this. And it's interesting because there's an association of museums across the US, and when they started embracing this was literally 15 years ago, the idea of DEIA, they called it IDEA. That narrative shifted 2 years later when they realized that by calling it IDEA, it was only an idea. So they made it a harder acronym to say, DEIA. Because it forced people to start actually doing the work. So it's a new concept relative to museums and historical sites, but everyone across the US is realizing if we're going to remain relevant, if we're going to meet people's needs, which have changed, we have to do that work. So that's the biggest thing for museums and historical sites is realizing you have to do the work.
Pat, as a historian and as an academic, can you kind of elaborate a little bit on what Alison was talking about in terms of what initiatives institutions are taking to kind of reconcile these histories?
Part of what is going on, I think, at a pretty profound level is an attempt to rewrite U.S. history in the broadest sense to incorporate indigenous people's histories, so that there are loads of books that are out there doing that right now. One of the best is a textbook. It's meant for college students, but there's a sort of junior high version by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz called An Indigenous People's History of the United States. I recommend it to everybody. It will rock your world, literally. And Pekka Hamalainen, a Finnish scholar who wrote a book called Comanche Empire, just came out with a book called Indigenous Continent. And there are all of these efforts on the part of scholars, both indigenous and non-indigenous, to try to reconcile a history that we have as a settler colonialist state with the place and the persistence and the survival and the survivance of Native peoples. So that is happening at the scholarly level, and it's happening in university teaching and trickling down into K-12 classrooms as well. And children, fourth graders who come to Rancho Los Cerritos are experiencing the effects of that as they're redesigning the programming here. And I think the other thing that's happening that institutions are increasingly doing is trying to engage in oral history collection and documentation as a way of allowing and encouraging and enabling peoples who do not typically write histories, who are not recording journals and diaries and publishing personal memoirs, to have their voices recorded as important elements of the past. And I don't know if anyone has seen the recent exhibit on women's history at the Historical Society of Long Beach. And my impression, it's a wonderful exhibit, my impression was that they basically just issued a call. If you've got a great woman in your family and you live in Long Beach, tell us about it. And so it's women from all over the place, all walks of life, all sorts of backgrounds, and their family members have contributed photographs, and letters and documents, some of the artifacts, but oral histories, and it gives one a more complicated, more diverse, more nuanced, more inclusive view of the past. And I think oral history has a lot of potential, because anybody can be trained to do oral history in a way that can create a massive archive of recordings that you can hear and catch the nuances in people's voice and emotion, and transcripts that can be researched. I could imagine walking around a place like this and the oral histories that are done in the early 70s. People could be accessing them on their phones and listening to some actor or some member of the community read snippets of them. So just making it more inclusive, more vivid, having more emotional impact.
Yeah, and I think that's great. Seeing all those initiatives being taken on by institutions is really it's exciting, right? Because it's allowing us to have access to all of these histories that for so long we have been withheld from. And so it's really interesting to see these institutions kind of take on that role and really kind of take accountability for also being part of the reason that those histories were withheld from us in the first place. So it's great to see institutions like Rancho Los Cerritos kind of taking on this conversation, to even be bringing it up, and especially in a time like now when we're seeing legislation being passed to stop these kinds of conversations from happening. We've seen what Sanchez has been doing, and people familiar with his work and who are supportive of his work, trying to keep AP African American Studies from mentioning the word racism or implying that there was slavery. It's very helpful for us as a community to kind of be able to rely on our institutions to help us recover all that was lost in the process of this becoming a settler nation. And so I realize we're running low on time, and so I want to ask one last question before wrapping everything up to Edgar and Gloria about now seeing that these institutions are more willing to engage in these conversations. What do you guys find to be something that you would like to see the institutions foregrounding in terms of the history of either Mexican American or Tongva people in this area? What are some concepts and ideas that you would like to see being explored?
I appreciate your question, but I think it's more of a question of what they would want to see. My ancestors aren't originally from here. I grew up in this area in Southern California, and but one thing that would be interesting is maybe a comparison or sharing stories from different areas of California, Mexican American and indigenous laborers, farm laborers. Maybe finding a way to collect oral histories from descendants of those indigenous and Mexican American people. And I think just focusing on more indigenous generated programming, like actually collaborating versus just consulting.
Edgar, same question to you. What kind of ideas or projects would you like to see being taken on by these institutions?
Sure. I'd like to thank, first of all, Alison for inviting me and Carlos because they're doing something about what's represented of the indigenous people. There was some research I did that about Los Cerritos here, this ranch, by Sarah Bixby Smith. She wrote a book that's quite popular around. It's called Adobe Days, a book of California and memories. Well, when I read it, there wasn't very little said about the Native American people. She talked a lot about the families, but The only thing she really said was, well, when the cattle industry failed here and Temple and Gota were losing the property, basically Smith referred to the indigenous people as humble retainers, which I thought was kind of weird. Humble retainers, I was like, well, what are they? Who are they? Who are retaining? What are you retaining? And how humble are we? Very little was said. Sheep herders here, of course, were mostly Basque descendants. She says something even, well, what did she say? Sheep herders mostly Basque, but some were a gay band of Mexicans. That was kind of strange. A history of Rancho Los Cerritos and Salamitos by Bill Walden. He wrote his postgraduate PhD thesis. There's no mention, no reference to Native Americans. The closest who came to that was Rancho Los Cerritos author Iris Engström. She did mention people, and she did say meals were prepared by two Chinese cooks. She mentioned names like Jose, Romulo, Miguel, who were Native Americans who worked here for the Temple family and for Abel Stearns and the Bixby family. And there were some pictures in the extra book, a cousin of mine, Ernie Salas, and also a contemporary who was at Cal State from Long Beach, Celia Vitra. She's in charge of the Native American and Graves Protection Act that we have. And so what Los Cerritos is doing is very impressive, and I've had the opportunity to do a couple of presentations. And getting back to your question, I think the oral histories of people could be found. Certainly, our tribe could identify certain descendants of those who lived here, worked here. Another area that could be explored here is the archaeology of this area. And there's a lot of archaeology sites that are documented, and I'm working on one currently at Cal State Long Beach. There are infrastructure projects, new housing for students, hot and cold water, electrical, and Wi-Fi systems. If they do excavations, we have to be there with a group of archaeologists to monitor that. So we could discuss the archaeology of this area, which is still ongoing.
Thank you. Yes, so those are certainly things that I think would be very beneficial to these institutions, right? Being able to hear directly from community members and Native community members who might, like Alison said, right, like really asking people, what is it that you think, how do you think the institution can serve you? How do you see the institution reconciling these two histories? And so for the last question, and this question is kind of like a pie in the sky kind of question. I like to think about this because it kind of helps me envision futures where these reconciliations have happened and where we can kind of live in a more equitable way. So my question to you all is, how do you imagine this site or other historical sites existing and interacting with people if the land was returned to indigenous hands? And we can start with Gloria and kind of make our way down to that.
Yeah, I think it's not, it's not about me, it's about actually building a relationship with the original stewards, building trust too, and showing support in order to have that relationship to share space here. I think, giving land would give access for indigenous peoples to, maybe grow their traditional foods, practice their ceremonies. That's how I feel about it. It's not really, I'm not sure if there's a right answer. I don't know everything. But I think it starts with building a relationship and having those difficult conversations to build that.
And I would agree with Gloria. I wouldn't presume to say if Indigenous people were the ones responsible for all of the programming and everything else that was going on in this space, what that would be. But as a historian who's seen things other places, I'll just tell you a couple of things I could imagine. So first of all, if Indigenous people were in charge of this space and considered it a sacred site, they didn't want outsiders to be present, that would be their prerogative. That happens elsewhere. Or if there were ceremonial times where they didn't want outsiders present, that would be their prerogative. Interesting things that have happened elsewhere. In St. Louis, where I've done research, the Osage Nation, which is headquartered in Oklahoma, has purchased a piece of property. It's the only monumental earthwork, the only piece of historic Native American mound building that stands within city limits. It has 3 houses built on top of it, and the homeowners haven't wanted to sell them. The people in the house on the top finally died, and they were able to purchase that land. The Osage have removed that house and a tree that was damaging the mound, and they are working toward making an entire protected area that would be not only for Osage uses, but part of a bi-state Missouri and Illinois sort of park system through indigenous sites for educational purposes. One final thing that I don't know if you all have ever been to the Museum of Tolerance on the west side. They have a timeline there that I think is really effective for communicating the way the past is multi-layered. And I think that any site, any place, any museum, any city can do this, that in a way that asks us and invites us to engage with these multiple levels of the past, so that they've got at the Museum of Tolerance a timeline that starts, I believe, in 1619, and on the top it's a timeline of freedom and tolerance, and on the bottom it's a timeline of intolerance. 1619 is the year that the House of Burgesses was founded in Virginia, the first representative assembly, the first form of democratic self-governance in what became the United States. 1619, for those of you familiar with the 1619 Project, is also the year when Africans were first brought into what became the United States in bondage. That the slave trade had already been going on for 100 years in the Americas, but 1619 was that year. And I could imagine a timeline at a place like this that has what's going on with the Tongva over time, all of the different groups, when they came to the Rancho, where they are in Long Beach in Southern California, and visitors being able to contribute to that timeline. But I don't agree.
I've thought a lot about this question, because I know a lot of historical sites and what's happening across the world, and there are some sites that are giving land back. Australia is one of the probably preeminent countries that is giving land back to tribes. It's not to the indigenous people, excuse me. It's happening in Canada. There's a project happening in Washington right now where they are giving land back. And when they're giving the land back, The indigenous people aren't asking people necessarily to vacate their homes, but what they're asking for is decision-making and how the land is used, and power within those conversations to say, this is how we think it should be used, this is how you think it should be used, let's work together on how this land is being used. It's not saying some people automatically, well, wait, you're gonna give the 5 acres back? No, but what we're saying is we need to invite the people in as equals in having that decision-making power. That's what, when we're giving land back, whether it's physically or just intellectually, it's what do those conversations look like? And again, we're not telling the indigenous people this is what we're gonna do. We're asking, what should we do? How do we do it? Help us understand, help us reconcile as we deal with our own reconciliation efforts. It's the conversation, it's the multiple perspectives on every story that we share, and we have to be very explicit in understanding that, is to understand our implicit biases and have explicit conversations on how we reconcile those.
Well, I have a outside there's a whole group of angry natives who are going to take over this place tonight. So give you a heads up on what you have to say. No. I don't speak for, I don't speak for the nation itself. I'm not a spokesperson. I'm not a council member anymore. Just the question is, the answer would be an individual response. Carlos in the opening statement recited part of the land acknowledgement that we are the stewards of the land. No, we're not. As far as I'm concerned, we're not stewards of this land here, Los Cerritos. We're part of it, and I agree with Alison that her definition of sharing and inviting, that's what's happening. That's what I'm doing today. And so it's important for the stewardship of this property is shared by not only administrators, but volunteers, and their board of directors, and those the donators who keep this property going. That's the stewardship. We're seeking land for another purpose, and for our tribe. And as far as I'm concerned, we've learned from brave people like the Sioux, Wounded Knee, and from the American Indian movement, and what's happened to them when they try to get back their land. And it's still going on. You know, the pipeline in the Dakotas, people walking in freezing temperatures to protest those kinds of sites. But I totally agree with Alison sharing this, and it's happening. I've already made a couple of presentations now, and hopefully there'll be more sharing in the future.
Thank you, and thank you all for being so open to, discussing these topics and these issues, which I'm sure can be a little intimidating, especially when some of us might feel like we don't know, there's so much we don't know. So, engaging in these conversations can feel a little bit like maybe there's just other things that we have to consider that are going to take time for a lot of us to learn, especially, people whose jobs it is to learn these things. If it's difficult for you guys, for us, and I can imagine it being even more difficult for just the everyday person. But the fact that we're all here and that we're all engaging in this conversation, I think is very encouraging to kind of imagine futures in which these conversations have already happened, and we are now living in a moment of action, right? What can we do now? How can we move on from here? So I want to thank you all again, and thank you all for coming. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A, so if anyone is brave and wants to ask questions. Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned that the name Tongva is not the original name. You know, how did the name Tongva come to be?
The name Tongva started around maybe 1900, around there. And there was a ethnographer by the name of Guerrero. I like his work more than a lot of other ethnographers, people who study other native people. He asked this woman, the Spanish call you this name, the Mexican government call you this name, what do you call yourselves? Her response was, we call ourselves Tongva. It's kind of the term is really, in the textbooks you'll see the definition is people of the earth. Well, not be confused with people from Mars. But the concept of Tongva was a layer, a strata, a position that there were different layers in this universe. And people were part of that universe that were called people of Tongva, as in contrast to the stars, to the cosmos, to animals, and to mountains and so forth, and to water. So Tongva, somewhere around there meant people of the earth.
Isn't the term also, like Los Alamitos refers to the Puvungna, as the term for the native people who don't understand the original actions of the scientists?
Is that in general? Yeah.
I only know the term Puvungna as the name for the settlements, the Tongva settlements that may have been at the site of Cal State Long Beach right now.
Okay.
The 23 acres right at Bellflower and Beach Boulevard, where there have been, as Edgar knows, native people's remains reinterred. But that was my understanding, but I'm not a specialist.
Okay. I only know that I have the book that Los Alamitos Rancho put out some years ago. And it does use that term,
Right.
and the layers of how it happens to refer to those people, or that it's specific to a site, if that's it, I didn't realize.
My understanding is that it's specific to the site, and there are people on campus who wear t-shirts that say Cal State Puvungna.
Yes.
But I'm not the expert on that.
Thank you.
Puvungna was a site, ceremonial and
Okay,
trading
it's
site,
site-related, not a name for the.
not a name for a tribe.
Right.
It's
Thank you for correcting my misunderstanding.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I have a couple of unrelated questions. One is, how much of this programming, the DEIA programming, is being done at your sister Rancho Los Cerritos? And the second question is, I'm related to, well, I asked the first question because my family has roots in Los Cerritos, but I'm also related to the Ahwaanga tribe. And I don't know the history in detail, but I understand in the maybe early 60s, 5 women from the tribe went to, probably with a bunch of attorneys, went to Washington, D.C. to argue for their land, and they got their land back. Of course, the desert, I think, is probably easier to return to folks than, an urban place like LA. But is there some vision for the Tongva to do the same, to argue the case in Washington? We have a Native American Secretary of the Interior now. Does that help?
The first part of your question was that?
I guess that's for Alison, and the second part was.
Yes, Rancho Los Cerritos has worked with the Native American Indian Department at Cal State Long Beach for quite some time, and they have developed a video on water, and they have a 4th grade curriculum around Indigenous people. So they have been doing that work. I would say both sides are doing the work in different ways, as each one's reach on our own journey. And they're doing it kind of program by program, where we're doing it across the board in a more cohesive manner, but both sides are doing the work.
As far as I know about the Ahwaanga nation in Japan, they weren't originally in a desert. The Guerreros did have desert property, but that particular, what you're talking about, is that they were forced to relocate there. So in terms of Gabrielino-Tongva, we've been in the process of petitioning for recognition and self-determination for a number of years, and the big problem, a large problem, is that there are 4 or 5 different factions who totally disagree with the concept of what land they get. Some people say that we're going to get a casino. Other people are saying that we're just going to grab land, and that one tribe itself, one council, is going to take over and not share with others. And so that's part of the problem, which goes back into Washington. And those people in the Office of Federal Acknowledgement, as it's called, look at the petitions and say, well, who's the leaders? I mean, don't you have one voice? No, we don't. We don't have one voice. We're different voices. And so that is the second element that's keeping us from moving ahead. And the third one, as far as I'm concerned, is that other tribes don't want us to get recognition. Your tribe, for example, Korean, and Changa, and San Manuel, they're all going to be the first ones to lobby Washington to not for us to continue, because they're going to say, well, they're going to put a casino up in Allen County. And so they're afraid of the competition. And the fourth thing, of course, is being ongoing for a long time. There's like 7 criteria that you have to leap over to continue your petition. And there's 2 of them that are really almost impossible. I mean, they're like really crazy criteria to overcome. You have to show that you were an organized tribe 200, 300 years ago. That you were continuously meeting as a tribe, as an organized tribe. And how can we do that? I mean, with all the cultural changes and the wars, Gabrielino-Tongva were concerned about survival.
Thank you, Edgar. Any other questions?
I just have a comment. And first, I just want to congratulate all of you, the panel, for coming forward and sharing your thoughts and ideas with us as a community. And I have to feel reassured by the content, because as young student activists over 50 years ago, when we started, at Long Beach State, Phyllis started at UC Santa Barbara, none of this was even being discussed. The revisionist history that's taking place is probably the most promising, because it basically is beginning to tell everyone's story. I think probably the most effective yet damaging policy that both Mexicans and the United States promulgated or enacted against people of color primarily was this notion that they were subhuman, that they didn't count, that they were something other than a person. And it's taken a long, long time to begin to unwind that. But to hear you talk about that textbook, which we have, it's a very difficult read for a person of color, because the history of America and the history of the world is one of conquer and take, and who had the bigger stick with the biggest gun. So, of course, the indigenous people didn't have a lot of weaponry or things like this, so things were taken and what have you. But still, I believe that we are making this positive movement. I'm very happy to serve on the PIA committee with Alison and other Susan and other members of Carlos. These are incremental steps, but they're positive. And I do want to congratulate particularly the historians and the Chicago Studies. They didn't have Chicago Studies when we were there, but we created it before we left. So anyway, I just want to acknowledge that. Any comment? Good.
If I could respond to what you were saying, what's your name?
Ron.
Nice to meet you, Ron. I just wanted to say that when you said it's very difficult to read Dunbar Ortiz's Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States as a person of color, I have to tell you that all of my students, people of color and white people, find it very difficult to read as well. And I had a student say in class the other day, what am I supposed to do with this? And I teach a lot of students who are planning to get teaching credentials and teach 5th, 8th, 11th grade in California and Long Beach schools. They say, what are we supposed to do? And she said, I feel so guilty. She said, I feel like, this was a white student who said this. She said, I feel so guilty. I don't know how I'm supposed to do this research project or what I'm supposed to do. And so we had a conversation about it. And I said, you cannot feel guilty for what people in the past did. Those people are not your responsibility. What is your responsibility right now is to the present and to the future. You're responsible for your actions, for the way you talk and write, what you read, what you think, and how you teach when you go into classrooms. And I think that's where we have to go.
And I do think also, Ron, thank you so much for bringing up that point, because I think for a lot of people, these conversations, especially people who have connections to Native people or enslaved people, it's really difficult to have, to just even read about those things. I remember mentioning to Carlos that even in the development of this exhibition, and having to go over the types of laws that were enacted that made it, that criminalized Native people, Mexican people. That kind of stuff is hard to read as somebody who is Mexican and Native, right? It's almost like you're reliving trauma, somebody else's trauma, and all of that is kind of stored within our bodies. And so I do think it's important to recognize that, and also to always keep that in mind when you're having these conversations. So if you're somebody who wants to learn more about these things, keep remembering that, sure, approach these topics with curiosity, but also with a level of respect and understanding that the people who can help, the people who have these histories, this information, it is a tough process to have to relive that over and over again. But the people who do that are the people who want to do the work to bring all those things back and to enable this process of reconciliation. So yes, I think that is a wonderful thing to kind of end this conversation on, a wonderful note to end this conversation on. And I want to thank everyone again for being here and for participating and listening. And I hope that this all informs your concepts of home and helps you, connect with other people and understand other people's concepts of home and develop something communally as a community. So Thank you all very much for being here. And welcome as well to our wonderful panelists, who have